I'm very excited to be speaking here at a Mumbai Local session today. I'm going to start by speaking a little bit about my writing and then sharing some poems before opening it up to questions. One of my identities is that I'm a writer, I'm a poet, and an essayist. I'm also someone whose job it is to write book reviews, interview writers, artists, performers, analyze literary award shortlists. I'm engaged with the world of creativity every day. In the course of my work, I read writers, particularly from India, and learn about experiences and history from different parts of the country every week. Most recently, I've become acquainted with the administrative failures that worsened the Chennai floods of 2015 from Tukpa Jay's Rivers Remember, learned about Santhal lives from the fiction of Hansda Sawender Shekhar, the importance of making art in Kashmir through the poetry of Asiya Zahoor, and more about the roots of communal distrust from The Anatomy of Hate by Regati Lord. Avni Doshi's novel A Girl in White Cotton taught me about mothers and daughters and the betrayals that memory can hold. I'm sharing a sampling of the literature I come across because I want to highlight that there's a tremendous number of incredible writers from India who are little known and whose work enriches mine and has the power to enrich any reader who should seek it out. The part of my job that I probably most enjoy is interviewing writers because it constantly expands my own understanding of what creativity is. Sometimes I see art and writing and even Netflix as places where one can take one's sadness to be treated or temporarily parked. Sometimes I see these places as sites where one can share joy and show solidarity because we all need more of those. Earlier this year, I had my first collection of poems come out with a great Indian poetry collective. It's called Terrarium, and it's about family, mental health, ecology in India, female friendships, and past and ongoing romantic relationships. Currently, I'm working on a collection of personal essays that'll be out next year with Penguin. It's about all of the ways in which depression and an anxiety disorder can infiltrate a life and the therapy, medication, community, and coping mechanisms I have built to allow my ill life to be fulfilling while also being hard. I grew up in Goa. It used to rain most of the year, and we were indoors a lot, and I spent that time reading. I read my first full length book, The Wizard of Oz, when I was 7, and after that, I never looked back. I read everything from Agatha Christie to Harry Potter to Alistair MacLean to Georgette Hare. I read from my parents' collections, my school library, whatever my friends happened to have around. I'm grateful for having read widely and across genres as a child. I still do. Right now, I'm reading a lot of fantasy and science fiction by female authors. Last year, it was crime fiction and memoirs about mental illness. The year before that, it was mostly poetry. I find that different genres of writing teach me in new and exciting ways about the human condition. As much of a cliche as it is, reading is for me an escape, a safe place to wander and daydream and be influenced. Books are not my only teachers, but they were definitely some of the earliest, and perhaps some of the easiest to warm up to at a time when I hadn't yet figured out how to have meaningful relationships with myself, other people, and the world at large. In school in Goa, I had a geography teacher called Miss Fatima, and it took me a very long time to realize that she had actually changed my life and paved the way for me to become a writer who was interested in ecology. She had that rare quality in her that she could make lessons genuinely interesting and invigorating. In her class, I learned to love maps and topography and terminology around rivers. They weren't abstract concepts to me. I lived in a very lush green state with the ocean right outside my school, a river on my daily bus rides to and from school. Sometimes there were snakes on my doorstep. In Miss Fatima's class, I was engaged and happy. I loved that we were class 10 students who still used color pencils. It took many wrong turns, many seasons for me to come back to my love of land and landscape. I graduated class 10 in Goa and moved to Delhi for high school and an undergrad degree in English literature. Growing up, I wasn't aware of any Indian writers in English that weren't very big names. One day, a guest lecturer came to my college and held a poetry workshop. She gave us a sheaf of papers with poems by young women poets I had never heard of: Anandita Sen Gupta, Sharanya Manivanan, Sridhala Swami. These were the first three young women poets from India I had ever encountered. I related to their work in a way I had not related to the older male and female poets whose work was far better known and hence far more easily available for consumption. After that, while I was still in college, I started interviewing these contemporary poets who I did not see covered in the media. I interviewed these poets for a small online magazine based in Bombay called Helter Skelter. The editor, Arun Kale, believed in me and encouraged me to write for them even though I was only a college student. Those interviews that I have now been doing for almost a decade have taught me that writers' lives are incredibly varied. Some walk the path alone, some thrive in community with other writers. Above all, I learned that there was no one way to be a writer. After 3 years of undergrad, I left to study an MA in creative writing in England. I did not know this at the time, but towards the end of my undergraduate degree in Delhi, I had become deeply clinically depressed. I had started to miss class. I didn't read any of the required texts. I did very, very poorly in my final exams. I thought I was just sick of being in a college and a program that didn't suit me. When I arrived in England, I sank almost immediately. I couldn't shake this heaviness, the sense of dread. I was overwhelmed with guilt at my inability to be happy in a course I had worked very hard to get into and that my family had worked very hard to support me in. I couldn't write. For the first time in my life, I couldn't read. I don't think I finished a single book outside my coursework that entire year. Because it would not in 100 years have occurred to me that I had depression. I just thought that I was selfish and unsatisfied. A classmate gently nudged me to see a general physician who diagnosed me with depression. I was put on medication and I started therapy. While at university, I met someone who also suffered from mental illness. She became one of my closest friends. We moved in together for the last months of my course in order to support one another and come out the other side in one piece. She and I would rise in the morning, make toast and tea, watch episodes of America's Next Top Model, and write poems for our final dissertation together. Aided by the medication, I was better than I had been the rest of the year, and I was able to write work that I felt was honest and even perhaps good. One of the poems I submitted for my final dissertation that year would make it into my first collection of poems, but that moment was still years away. After graduating, I came back to the UK and I didn't feel enamored by writing anymore. I thought if writing wasn't coming to me naturally, maybe it wasn't for me. Instead, I worked in the nonprofit sector for about 3 years. I didn't write, I read a little bit. I threw myself into work and into a relationship. I hadn't been able to make a meaningful life using words, and I thought I could make one inside a relationship and a job instead. I wasn't happy. I wasn't myself. I didn't really know who I was anymore. I had been erratic with my medication since I'd returned from the UK. I was racked by anxiety and depression. In 2015, the relationship ended. In 2015, I found a therapist who was good, empathetic, rigorous in her reasoning. She wasn't someone who just listened to me. She participated, she argued with me, she pushed back against my destructive ideas of myself, and she helped me develop good coping mechanisms. By 2016, I had begun to feel more whole. In addition to therapy, I took a small break from working full time. I took on part time assignments and, with my free time, attended a couple of writing retreats.
In a village called Bir in Himachal Pradesh, there is an annual writing workshop at the Deer Park Institute by a teacher called Janet Thomas. When I went to Janet's workshop, I was someone who was on the road to recovery, but someone who was still missing parts of herself. Janet began her first class by trusting us with a personal story. She had lost someone a few hours before we all met for the first time. She said, I'd be lying if I didn't share that with you. She said, I would want to give to the class what I'm asking from it, which is honesty. After Janice said what she said, the classroom did not grow heavy. I did not squirm because she had laid a difficult thing on me early that morning. Instead, the manner in which she held herself, the manner in which she told her story, has stayed with me. In the most true sense of the word, a storyteller for me is someone who is willing to talk to another person like they trust them, like they are the only two people in the room. All around me that day, I saw evidence of the fact that people responded to Janet's energy. Each person felt able to share a piece of themselves in their writing. I wrote a poem about fear, my first poem in a very long time. Looking back, I can now see that that first poem was an opening, a ramp, a starting point, if you will. It was a very emotionally charged poem, and though it was true of how I felt in that particular moment, it was the very first chapter of my story rather than the heart of it. After that first poem, I began to write again about mental health, about the relationship that had ended, about family, the things that brought me joy, the things that troubled me about the world. I wrote the poems in Terrarium, my poetry collection, over 3 years. They were deep dives into the cornerstones of my life. I didn't want to just scratch the surface. I wanted to reach below it and understand the true complexity in which our lives exist and sometimes crumble and sometimes thrive. Those words ended up taking me closer to myself and closer to moving forward. When I was writing these poems, I realized that the writing that most moved me as a reader was writing that was grounded in context and specificity. Writers who were writing incredibly detailed, intimate portraits in any genre were the ones that I was most drawn to. As an example, a simple scene set in a kitchen between two people talking about very mundane things could teach me about loneliness, the difficulty of connecting with another person, gender, power. I took that insight into my own writing, asking my poems to be about very small details or moments that held immense weight within them. Such as the moment when my friend and I were walking on a street one night and street dogs suddenly appeared and she was frightened. In that moment, I wanted to reassure her, wanted to protect her, wanted to help get her home despite the panic she was in. Within that moment, I recognized that there was protectiveness, fear, irrationality, socialization. There was the balmy night in the background to our walk. I drew from the richness of moments like these to craft poems that celebrated, examined, and critiqued these moments. Writing these poems, I would start with what moved me, and I would refine the poem by asking myself questions such as: is this what I really feel? Is this the detail that will draw the reader into the room? Have I changed my mind about the epiphany that I started this poem with? Has time brought me a new understanding that I can lend to this poem? Writing for me has been an act of intense scrutiny. I wanted to write about family and relationships with all of their complexity intact. I didn't want to settle for easy answers because that wouldn't feel true to my lived experience. More importantly, I didn't want to give up on people in these poems. I didn't want to dismiss certain people as one dimensional when really they had a complex impact on my life, full of every shade of joy and sorrow. I thought that there were many other people out there with these thoughts and experiences. And I wanted to put this robust, self aware, critical, but empathetic love for people and the natural world out there. There's a writer called George Saunders, who's an excellent fiction writer whose work you should read. He has a quote that I often return to. Open quote: find out what makes you kinder, what opens you up, and brings out the most loving, generous, and unafraid version of you. And go after those things like nothing else matters, because actually nothing does. Close quote. I'll just read that out once because it's a bit of a long quote. Find out what makes you kinder, what opens you up, and brings out the most loving, generous, and unafraid version of you. And go after those things like nothing else matters, because actually nothing does. For me, editing and reworking my pieces of personal writing has been exactly that. It's required me to be kind when I'd rather be angry, required me to see the other side when I so desperately wanted someone to see my own. The rewriting allowed me to have empathy towards both myself and the other people involved. I have a writing friend who also lives in Delhi who did me the gentlest service at this time. She read all my new hesitant poems. She held my hand as I second guessed myself and wondered if writing these poems and trying to get them published was the right thing for me. I wouldn't be a writer if I hadn't had a community of supportive female friends like her to guide me. Illness debilitates you. It takes away your time, your energy, your self confidence. I couldn't have made it through without the community that helped me up in the beginning. Outside of personal communities, the people I have found to be my best guides were other Indian or Indian diaspora female poets like Neetu Das, Sharanya Manivanan, Anandita Sen Gupta, Amy Nezuko Matathil, Sridhala Swami, and Imtiaz Dharkar. Over time, I have interviewed nearly all of these poets as well as countless others. I sought them out because we've chosen a strange life for ourselves, and I'm endlessly fascinated by the real perseverance that lies beyond creativity. Several of these writers have become friends and mentors over time. Like any industry, writing has pitfalls, learning curves, questions I don't yet have the answers to. Like any industry, there are people who intimidate you or make you feel small. I had these women writers to turn to for advice, for solidarity. I've held a small number of writing workshops over the last few years. The stories I always encourage other people to tell are the ones that only they can, the ones that scare and delight them, the ones that sit at the heart of who they are and portray the rich multitudes they all hold. With the exception of the beginning years of my mental illness, I've always read, I've always wanted to be engaged in the world of words. But I don't think I became a writer till very recently, when I embraced the fullness of my story. I don't want to romanticize illness, but like every experience, it is a lens, and I have chosen to see through it. Thank you. I want to read some of the poems that are connected to the things that I've been talking about. I'm going to start with a poem about the geography teacher that I referenced. Miss Fatima was someone who really instilled a love for the earth in me. And it was something, it took me a long time to recognize that she was the one who had first showed me how interesting um, a dull subject like geography can be, simply because she was willing to show her own wonder and her own interest to her classroom full of students. Miss Fatima. We had to come prepared to Miss Fatima's geography class, color pencils sharpened to an axle thinness, ready to mark the Narmada or run of Kutch, that salt flat that could rip our tongues to shreds if we licked it. Miss F was strict, no chit chatting, no coming late, shirt untucked. She sternly made us love every hip bone of river route, every stretch mark on riverbeds, every latch and lock of the Himalayan bulwark. even the rough math of contouring. Every inch of thread, a kilometer, we traveled far on Miss F's ruler. Three light blue waves denoted an ocean, one steady line a pond. In her class, everyone got to be an artist and a perfect marksman. Our final exams took place in a hall with dramatic windows opening out to Miramar Beach. Sand and salt settled on our answer sheets as our pencils moved instinctively to mark Port Blair. We knew the map of India like people supposed we knew the cuts and flat moles on our own hands. To this day, I think memorizing capitals is silly. What sticks is Miss Fatima's voice in my head, teaching me how to love this bruised and bumpy earth. Some of the poems in this book are about climate change, the way this small and big disasters that have happened recently in India's environmental history. And this next poem is called Spilt, and it's about the Enor oil spill from January 2017 when two oil tankers collided. One was empty and one was full. And as one was leaving the port and one was entering, they collided, and 9.9 million tons of oil spilled into the water near the port. And there was a massive civilian cleanup effort. And reading about people wading into the water and pulling the oil out with their hands really moved me. And this is a poem about that. Spilt. 1,000 people in Ennore know the smell of spilt oil. The words oil gush like blood from a wound can be traced back to a young fisherman who saw a ship bleed into his sea. In science class, they promised us oil floats above water, black lotus fronds held still by nothing, floating past each eastern beach. Upturned like umbrellas, turtles washed up, no longer breathing. 1,000 people in an oar scooped the oil out with their bare hands. If the ship had made it to port, this viscous liquid would have been used to start car engines. I wonder if the people of Ennore can feel the purr of all that unused energy. Will one go home tonight, run those slicked fingers through his wife's hair, braid it into a glossy serpent beached on her brown back? This next poem is about something similar that happened in 2016 when 81 pilot whales washed up on the coast of Tamil Nadu between Kalamosi and Manapad. And there are varying theories about why that happened, but one of them was that the whales had consumed plastic accidentally. And I've written a poem in the voice of those whales. It's called The Pilot Whales Speak. We're surprised when they open and find a length of plastic like a river swimming within us. We did not see ourselves this way. Hearing them speak, it appears we are to blame. We're trying to remember what we ate for dinner, who lived within us and took us to shore. We have tribes waiting at home. We know better than to wait. They let us sit on our sides like that one ship that lost its way. We're turning into boulders, but no water comes to circle us in mercy. We're not sure they sewed us back up. Are we imagining this? Small feet climb within us to marvel at complete darkness. As they exit, a guttural sound close to breathing. A woman is wiping our eyes with a washcloth. In the distance, a man opening and closing a white light many times. I mentioned that my female friends were crucial at a time when I was deeply sick, and several of them lived with me in the days where I really couldn't cope by myself. And this is a poem called In Sickness and in Health, because I think friendships are some of the most fortifying relationships in our lives. In sickness and in health. When my body reaches for and does not arrive, my girlfriends hold me as their own, in a portico of light welding into possibility. One is young. We sleep with string on a small bed like siblings. One has a heart like a canoe and a house with a constricted staircase. I creak down in the mornings to find her with tea, readying the toast to hold together the day. One is older and knows how to leave a place without guilt. She trusts me with a canvas and paint, tells me there is nothing you can do wrong. When telling a vein from an illusion, a jacaranda from a stub is beyond my powers, this is their work. To lift a drop stitch, to move the needle tediously forward, looping detail in yarn till I am ready. The second section in this book is entirely about one relationship, a past relationship, and it's a section in which I tried to capture the nuance of that relationship, the good and the bad, everything in between. Um, One of the earliest poems I wrote after the end of this relationship was called The First Summer After You. The first summer after you. I've not been held in a while. The satsumas are soft in their shells from weeks of rest. I have headaches the size of Crete. The bathtub is full of lemon I enter into and enter out of. Your perfume hits me in the jaw. My stomach rises and falls like the Third Reich, over and over in the public imagination. In my dreams, I'm whole like a Virginia porch on a summer's day with a pitcher of iced tea to go. I dance in the interim between work and dinner, and I move like a 70s mom with a turntable on. I eat watermelon straight from the skull. I still reach for you in the dark. Um, I'm going to read a couple more poems from this particular section. This one is called In Praise of Drool. The New Year's Eve, I slept on the floor. I knew one of us had to leave. It took another 17 months because there is no manual on how to resist a man who steps off a moving train, who circles a roundabout at 120 kilometers per hour, who says he will change in the morning. I climbed back into bed before he woke up, afraid to admit how little I could bear the rise and fall of his chest in the sheets. I chomped on a chili and smiled, told everyone, look how green I grew this in my garden. But next to you, I sleep like a child at sundown. My mouth leaves a trail of moon drool, tooth whisked, quiet as sugar melting off the tongue. This is the final poem in that particular section about the relationship. It's called Meanwhile in Cyprus. Do you think there are undrunk cups of tea in Cyprus waiting for two people who will no longer go? Do you think indigo is a color for being alone? Forgive me, I am in the habit of asking what you think. I want to end with a couple of poems that highlights what I was talking about earlier when I said that I like to take small moments and to pay respect to the fact that small moments can hold multitudes within them. The first one is called A Beginner's Guide to Loving What Must Be Loved. I mean the smell of Dettol, the fat wad of cotton wiping the bleeding canvas of a wound on the inside of one of my mother's ankles. I mean soaking up the blood, cleaning the surrounding epidermis till only the eye slit of the wound remains, a scratch to account for all that bleeding. Sometimes it's like I'm playing a part, an easy part in a movie. A young woman looking worried but determined carrying a boy with a broken elbow through a hospital corridor. Or a young woman sliding her hands under the armpits of an old woman who has fallen down at the airport. What I'm trying to say is that some parts are easy, some roles make me shine. The hard part is keeping my arm from flinching when my partner touches it in apology. The hard part is figuring out how gently to reassure him when street dogs begin to follow us home and he stiffens, learning how to make the instruction of don't look back at the dogs, don't engage, sound like comfort, sound like in just a minute we're going to be home. This poem is called The Years Come a Tumbling. A little bit of background to this poem. When I was 6, my mom had to create a costume for annual day. Everybody had to go in fancy dress. And she used one of those old cardboard boxes and silver foil to create wings. And I lost one of them. And she was really upset about it. Um, so it's called The Years Come a Tumbling. It took long hours to fashion a set of wings out of cardboard and silver foil, to pour glue out of a blue bottle, paint with a flat brush to the very edge. My mother punched holes, slipped drawstrings borrowed from petticoats, and tied them on my back. As these stories go, at the close of the school day, I returned one winged. My mother was inconsolable. Once, overcome with the wrong sort of love, I slipped a silver ring studded with moon off my finger and handed it to a boy. What a gesture. When he broke the delicate metal, I wanted only the ring. The boy could stay where he was. But each time I asked for the pieces to repair, he refused. Promises that he would fix it himself were followed by anger. What did one ring matter? I reached for reasons. A gift from an aunt when I first left home, my favorite stone. But why should I explain why I love a thing? I wept at the loss, more proof I was shallow, not as pure in my love as I claimed. It took me 20 years to remember my mother bending her weight into the scissors to carve wings from a thick board, to recall how I have no memory of when the string loosened, when the silver trailed into the crowd, how I was maddened by her grief. Now I reach for the phone to tell her I never got the ring back, to apologize that I had misplaced the love pulled from her like water from a stone. Thank you. Um, I'll hand over to Samira to open. Yeah, we'd love to open it up for questions if anyone would like to ask anything, and we'll pass the mic around. And do remember to speak into the mic because it's being recorded.
Hi, Urvashi. Nice to see you after a long time. Uh, I want to know that so the title of your book is Terrarium. What's the significance of the title?
So there's a poem called Terrarium in the collection, and the poem was written before the collection was named, and it's about how I used to play football as a young girl in Goa, and there was something about that memory, Every time I thought of those football training sessions, playing in the mud, playing in the rain, falling into the puddles, it felt very visceral, very real to me. Like I had a snapshot of that moment in my head, and I felt like that's kind of what a terrarium is to me. It's something. It's a world within itself. It's A terrarium is usually a glass structure with a living plant inside it, and it supports an ecosystem all on its own. And that's what these moments felt like to me. They felt like stories that could stand on their own, and that's why I named the collection terrarium.
Thank you.
So there's a question that I have about, um, while you were reading from while you were in the first part of your talk, you talked about how at the moment when you fell ill, you felt that if writing wasn't coming naturally, then maybe you weren't meant to be a writer. And then over your experiences and over studying and etc., I'm keen to hear from you how you view writing now. As it is it something that comes naturally? Is it something you work out? How do you work on your poetry? You know.
I think my experiences definitely taught me that that sometimes writing was going to come naturally and sometimes it wasn't, that there were going to be months where I wasn't writing, when no ideas were striking me. And I learned to get comfortable with that. And one of the reasons for that was I know another writer called Atti Rao, and she told me that she used to get worried when she hadn't written a poem in like a few months. She was like, what if it doesn't come back again? But she said over the years, she realized that it always comes back. And I found that that's been my experience as well. I think my relationship with the word natural has changed a lot since becoming depressed for the first time, because I know that sometimes when I don't feel like doing anything, and sometimes when I'm in a funk, I'm just in a state of inertia, I know that that doesn't necessarily mean anything. It just could be a biochemical dip. Yeah, I just have to learn to wait it out. I don't have to make dramatic decisions like I'm not meant to be a writer. This job isn't for me. I've learned to see these things as seasonal much more and to be patient for when the writing comes along.
And can you talk a little bit about how craft has found its way into your writing? Because you had mentioned that your schooling in England made a huge difference in the way you looked at that. Yeah.
So I did an MA in creative writing, and I learned a lot in that course. But because I was depressed, it took me a long time to actually be able to use those lessons. But what I learned the most from was reading books about craft, doing tons of different writing exercises, reading other writers who resonated with me. It wasn't till I started finding writers whose work really moved me, poets whose work really moved me, that I myself started to think about poetry differently. I was like, oh, this person is writing an interesting poem that I would never have thought to write. What is my version of that poem? So it wasn't copying, it was learning from them and understanding that everyone is writing their version of the same poem all of the time, and giving myself space to do that. But a lot of the intricate technical craft stuff I got from books.
Hi, Urvashi. Nice to see you. So my question is that now it's been some time that your book is out. So like when you're reading this after a gap of so many months, do you, as a writer, do you feel like changing something? Like, does it make you cringe or like, like, does it feel like it's set in stone or would you like to, write more drafts of it?
There's definitely things that make me cringe, things that feel a little like I was a different person when I wrote that, so I don't really connect to it exactly anymore. I don't feel like it's set in stone, but I'm happy that the book is a way for me to put those poems behind me, because you can keep working on a poem forever. And I put it I put them out into the world when I thought they were strong enough. There's a line, a word or two, even when I'm reading out to live audiences, there's a just instinctively I'll change a word because I'm like, no, that fits better. And I'm aware of the fact that I'm doing that, but I'm also okay with the versions that are out there right now. I understand that it's constantly evolving, and I don't feel the need so much anymore to obsess about those things.
Thank you.
Especially when you're a young poet, you had mentioned particular inspirations and people that you had interviewed. Can you share? Because I remember chatting with you, you had talked about a certain poet, I think, who you had read in the US, who was a Filipino. Yeah. And that something happened in that. And it's interesting for me I'm asking about that world uh, that inspires the poet in some sense.
So the poet that I was telling Samira about in our first meeting is Amy Nezuko Matata. She's has a Malayali father and a Filipino mother, and she grew up in the U.S. But a, a significant amount of her work is India-centric as well. I discovered her work maybe 7, 8 years ago, and I think it really changed how I thought about poetry, what I thought was possible within it, because her poems were love poems. They were love poems to her dog, they were love poems to the good parts of her marriage, to the natural world. And there was something, and none of it made me cringe. It wasn't too sappy, it didn't feel unrealistic, it wasn't that at all. You could see that she was making these radical acts of celebrating what is good in life. And when I saw that, I was like, oh, I really want that for myself. I want to be able to see people in this way, because I know that there are those aspects in my life, but I don't pay enough attention to them. And I definitely don't pay deliberate attention to them. And so I started writing poems that had some of the same energy, because I was imbuing it from her. I think she's 4 books now, but at that time she had 3. So I read all 3 of her books. And what I tend to do when I find a writer that I really like is that I find as much of their work as possible. I did that with the other Indian poets that the poetry workshop in my first year of college introduced me to. I hunted down their books. It wasn't easy because they were published by places like Sahitya Academy that don't have very good distribution. So you would have to go to one place in the entire city that would keep like one dusty copy somewhere at the back. And but I felt like it was worth it, because those poets were extremely eye-opening. They showed me that it was all right to write about the experiences of a young woman, of a young person, and that you didn't have to write about big things. You could just write about, a fight with your father. You could write about a nice walk you had in the park. As long as you brought that poem up to its strongest possible version.
Someone here mentioned that these poems were, the book was published some time ago. So the poems must have been written much earlier,
So the book was only published about 6 months back.
only 6 months back. And the poems in them, many of them refer to things also much earlier.
Yes, they do refer to things much earlier, but I only wrote these poems between 2016 and now. Yeah, 2016, 2018, yes.
And has much of your attitude or thinking or consideration changed since those poems were written?
Some of it has. I think that some of the things that interested me in this collection, such as the past relationship, isn't what interests me right now. It's something that I've put behind me. I think if I had to write mental health poems, that would look very different today. I am a very different person now, even than I was when the final version went to press, which might have been a year ago. And I like that. I like the fact that when you have books sort of come out at different times, you get to see a catalog of your different evolutions and how you've changed. Even when I'm reading the poems, I'm aware of the fact that I'm not that person anymore.
What brought about the change?
Um, I don't know if it was one thing in particular, but
No, the thrust of my question is in the expression of what you experienced in poetry, when you expressed it in poetry, was that one of the factors that stimulated the change?
do you mean like a recovery? Um, s- yes. I think that writing these poems, putting together this collection, was a way to close a chapter. It was a way to process difficult feelings. And I think if I had just written one draft of these poems, then that wouldn't have happened. But because I stayed with them for a long time, um, it really did allow me to seep deeper into these topics, into my own evaluation of my life. And I think putting the book out there in itself is a little bit transformative because you no longer have control over those poems. And that's also a very important thing to know as an artist, that there's only a certain point till which the work belongs to you, and then it belongs really to the space in which you have entered it. Yeah.
And if you revisit those incidents, things that we have mentioned there, would you see them differently or write about them differently?
Some of them maybe, but I think that a lot of these poems I wouldn't write about them very differently, because this book was very much the culmination of the fact that I was having to reevaluate my entire life in the wake of illness. And these were sort of hard won realizations that are in these poems. And I am quite confident in them, but suppose I were to write about the same people in the book, write new poems about them, I would probably write about different things, but not the poems in the collection themselves, no.
So, Urvashi, if I may ask, because you bring up the fact of your depression and the mental health many times, and you bring it up as part of your story, and many people who deal with mental health don't actually talk about it so easily or so openly, right? So I was just wondering if I could ask you that question: was there I'm trying to think how to phrase it. Did you have to make a choice? Was it a natural thing for you to do? Is there, because you've also mentioned that you get called to mental health conferences or panels a lot. So is there, what is your and you've also mentioned you're working on essays on mental health. So if you could talk a little bit about the choices you've made, having gone through what you've gone through.
I think my choice about whether to speak or not to speak about this was very much rooted in the fact that I felt very lost in the first couple of years when I fell ill. There wasn't much literature. I didn't have any awareness. Knew nothing about mental illness at all. I had to seek out literature. I had to research on the internet. And there's so much information out there that takes you a very long time to sift through it. I was 20 when, or 19, I think, when I first fell ill. And no, I was in college in Delhi when I first fell ill, yeah. Or when I was most conscious of being ill. I don't actually know when it started, but when it got really bad is when I noticed. I think it did come to me naturally that I wanted to talk about it. I was like, wait, I was one of those people who thought this stuff wasn't real. But it's happening, it's very real. And if I don't take on the responsibility of talking about it, then I'm just going to be perpetuating my own stigma. And so it was very clear straight away that it was something that I wanted to do. It was something that I was grappling with every day. The reality of it was in every aspect of my life. I found it hard to do my job. I found it hard to get out of bed. Found it hard to moderate my reactions to other people. So if I hadn't talked about it, I don't think that I would have been able to go on. I don't think I would have moved towards recovery if I hadn't talked about it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, absolutely. You had a question? You did this, so I thought you had a question.
Sorry, it's okay. Yeah, Urvashi, I'm curious to know whether any reader has interpreted any of your poem like quite differently from how you imagined it, and like, does it bother you when someone interprets it in a very different way?
I think it's only happened to me once or twice. I don't know if it bothers me unless someone brings it up at like a live session or something, and then I'm thrown off guard because I have to respond to somebody else's interpretation. And I don't know how to do that because I wrote the poem, it's in my head, I have my own understanding of what it means. And I often don't know how to respond to other people's interpretations because I understand that it's something that's coming from their lived experience and they're connecting it to it in their own way, and I'm completely all right with that. But I do struggle to answer questions around it.
I really did not want to ask this question, but she opened the field out. When you're talking about this depression in handling, have you heard of Tony DeMello and how he tackled Tony DeMello and how he tackled people with depression? No. Dom Moraes and Ranjit Hoskoti's introduction to his collected poems of Dom Moraes and what he spoke about, or Jerry Pinto's.
Right, yeah. I've read those.
There is a lot of, or Jane Bandari's book, Aqua.
I've not read Jane Bhandari's, but I've read the previous two, yes.
Do we have any further questions? Thank you. Thank you very, very much for a wonderful, wonderful session and for being for just sharing actually so openly. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, and
and
thank
thank
you
you
for coming today.